Welcome, everyone. We'll just give it just a few seconds for you all to hop on. It's right at 11:35, which is when this was starting. So, all right. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Eric. I will be your tech support and moderation for this session. Just as a reminder, the session is being recorded. And while I do not work for Zoom, if there are any problems, please reach out to me or put it in the chat, and I'll do my best I can to address your issues. During this session, we will have roughly a 20-minute presentation and then 20 minutes of Q&A, give or take some time with overlap with the presentation. If you do have any questions, you have two options to do so. You can, one, enter it at the chat at any time. I will be looking at those and keeping tabs on what order that they're in. And then also, if you would like to wait until the end of the presentation, there is a raise hand feature at the bottom center of your screen. If you would prefer to ask a question that way, I can elevate you and you can ask your question there. I would like to remind everyone that this is a family-friendly event, so any abusive behavior will result in removal from the session as well, and keep that in mind for your questions as well. Not that anyone is going to ask any nasty questions while we're on the air here. So with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed guest from the Presidencies of the United States. Jerry Landry is a lifetime student of presidential history. Jerry brings his podcasting work extensive research and scholarly research, data analysis, and effective strategies for learning and development, with the emphasis on leadership and team development. In his spare time, Jerry is an avid reader, gardener, and traveler, though he also enjoys some quiet time in Presidency's HQ with his better half and their head of cat in charge. And with that, I will hand it off to Jerry. Jerry, talk about Aaron Burr for a bit.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well today. Thank you so much for joining me. And it's always a pleasure to join everybody at the Intelligent Speech Conference. This is, I think, my third time presenting, and it's always a pleasure. And of course, when the theme of this conference was announced, of course, Aaron Burr was the first name that came to mind. If you're talking about deception, Aaron Burr is the person in the early republic that everybody thinks of. So in this discussion, we're going to explore who was Aaron Burr and what deception or deceptions did he practice. We're going to try and answer the question of what was his greatest one. And then we'll come back around to who was Aaron Burr really? Because we do have some myths to debunk or at least question. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce myself, as Eric said, and thank you so much for that warm introduction. I'm the host of the Presidencies podcast. This is actually my 8th anniversary of starting the podcast, started it back in 2017. I am a lifelong U.S. presidential history geek, and yes, I do dress like a different U.S. president each Halloween. This last year, I was Teddy Roosevelt, and it was so fun putting that costume together. It's always interesting to see how I'm going to pull it off, and this one was a particular delight, or as Teddy would say, delight. I am a married cat dad from North Carolina, and Aaron Burr is somebody that I've been thinking about for quite a while, since I started the podcast, and because my better half and I started a new special series, the Vice Presidencies of the United States, I was finally able to do a deep dive into Burr. I finally found an excuse to do that. And so, who was Aaron Burr? Let's go ahead and start there, because if you're not aware of Burr already, he was the third vice president of the United States. He was born in 1756 in New Jersey. He's a graduate of what was then the College of New Jersey. Now we know it as Princeton. He served as the Attorney General of New York, as a U.S. Senator, became vice president. But if you know Aaron Burr, you probably know him best as the murderer of Alexander Hamilton. There's an entire musical about that. I won't go into too much detail there. You may also know him as the head of what was called the Burr Conspiracy. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. He ended up passing away in 1836 in New York. And as you can see, these things, he's on a rise, and then things just seem to go off the rails. By the time Burr dies, he is disgraced. He is a figure who is reviled. In history, he's seen as being this evil manipulator, the villain, if you will, of the early republic. But let's explore that a bit. First of all, if we're going to understand Aaron Burr, we need to know who his enemies were. And you may recognize some of these folks. So on the left, we have Alexander Hamilton. In the middle, we have DeWitt Clinton. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, Thomas Jefferson. So just a quick introduction of these folks. Alexander Hamilton, of course, the first Secretary of the Treasury. He was the right-hand man of George Washington. He was also a big leader in the Federalist Party. And as I mentioned, Burr would end up killing him. DeWitt Clinton, you may not be quite as familiar with. So DeWitt Clinton was a major force in New York state politics. He was the governor of New York. He's best known for pushing through the Erie Canal. He was also a presidential candidate in 1812. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States. Aaron Burr would be his first vice president. Thomas Jefferson, of course, the crafter of the Declaration of Independence. He was the first Secretary of State under Washington. Him and Hamilton fought tooth and nails in the early republic, but he would also end up as an enemy of Aaron Burr. So we're going to come back to each of these folks in a little bit. But first, let's start to explore, what did Burr do that seems so scandalous? So let's start with the Manhattan Company. Manhattan Company in 1798, of course, New York City was growing, and just like any city, they needed infrastructure. And in this case, they wanted to bring water into the city. They needed a way to do that. And so folks started coming up with this idea, let's put together a company that would help to build this infrastructure to bring water to the city. The Manhattan Company would end up becoming a bank. And Aaron Burr was the one who made that happen. He did this because he wanted to counter Federalist domination of the banking industry in New York. At that point, Federalists were in charge of the city. They were pretty much in charge of the state. And Democratic Republicans were struggling. They needed loans to be able to support their political efforts. They needed a bank that could work for their interests. Now, that's going to be hard to do, just saying, hey, we want a Democratic Republican bank, because that had to be approved at the state level. And of course, if Federalists are in charge of the state, they don't want a bank to compete against their interests. So Burr comes up with the idea. He manages to slip in this language that the Manhattan Company could use its revenues in means that were undefined, but they could basically use their revenues to other interests. And that's how he was able to turn a water company into a bank. He even fooled Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton looked at this. He knew what was happening, but he missed this key part. And so Burr was able to transform the Manhattan Company into a bank that would support Democratic Republicans in their economic interest, and that in turn would help them in their political interest. So that's a big deception that Aaron Burr was able to pull off. But then a couple of years later, they had a presidential election. And John Adams was running for re-election, but he really wasn't a factor in this, because ultimately the electoral vote was tied between Jefferson and Burr. So Burr had been put up as Jefferson's running mate, but constitutionally, the way that the Electoral College was set up at the time, each elector cast two ballots, but there wasn't a distinction between I'm casting this ballot for president, I'm casting this ballot for vice president. It just went into a common pool. And so at that point, constitutionally, the highest vote getter became president, and the next highest became vice president. And that's how Jefferson had ended up as John Adams's vice president, because he came in second in the election of 1796. Now, this had worked well thus far if you throw votes to make sure that one person comes out on top, and then the next highest vote getter becomes vice president. In this case, Democratic Republican electors cast two votes, one for Jefferson, one for Burr, and so they were tied. So what happens at this point? At this point, it's thrown into the House of Representatives, and the House has to vote by state delegation. So each state has one vote. They have to decide who is going to be president, who's going to be vice president. Federalists looked at this as an opportunity. They knew that they were out. The Adams administration was on its way out. He was a lame duck at this point. But we've worked with Burr before. We've actually worked with him. Maybe we could work with him as president. Now, this ended up not happening. Alexander Hamilton, among others, was like, are you kidding me? This is Burr. This is that guy who turned a water company into a bank. Do you really want this schemer as president? And so ultimately, the election was decided in Jefferson's favor. So Jefferson became president, Burr became vice president. He would serve for 4 years, during which time he would also kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel. He didn't just walk up to him and shoot him. They dueled. But this is really starting to build this idea of Burr, the schemer, because he was a stone's throw away from becoming president when he wasn't supposed to be. And so this idea of the scheming Burr is really starting to build at this point. Then we have the Burr conspiracy. So Burr serves for 4 years as vice president. He ends up, Jefferson says, no way, I'm not running with this guy again. And oh, by the way, we've changed the Constitution. So now you have to have a distinction. You're casting one electoral vote for president, one electoral vote for vice president. That common pool is gone. Jefferson's going to get reelected. But at this point, George Clinton, who was the uncle of DeWitt Clinton we mentioned earlier, he becomes vice president. Burr is out. And Burr has to figure out what he's going to do. He's basically on the outs politically. He's trying to figure out what he can do now. Now, at this point in American history, there are so many people who are thinking about taking over Spanish lands, establishing a new republic in the West, maybe having the West break off from the US. So Burr kind of sees that the West may be a place that he can rise back to prominence. So he starts to gather men and supplies in the West. He starts to meet with leaders there, including this guy, Andrew Jackson, you may have heard of. He also starts talking with foreign powers, and he starts to talk with the British. He actually talks with the Spanish, even though the scheme, and one of the mysteries about the Burr conspiracy right now is trying to figure out exactly what his aim was. We really don't know. There were so many things that were talked about. It could have been that he was going to try and break off Texas from Spanish control, or break off all of Mexico from Spanish control, or break off the West from the US. We don't really know. They were aiming to do something, but he was trying to put together all of these folks, all these supplies, trying to get support. Word leaks out. And that's one thing with conspiracy theories. You know, you've got so many people involved in a conspiracy, somebody's going to squeal. Somebody's going to spill the beans. And word starts to get back to Washington. What's Burr up to? We don't really know, but it's bad. Of course, it's bad because it's Aaron Burr. It's going to be bad. It's going to be against the United States. Burr ended up being arrested, tried for treason, and found not guilty. And that definitely made Burr a burr in the saddle for President Jefferson, because he thought that he was finally going to expose Aaron Burr as the evil person that he was. But Burr ended up not being found not guilty, but his reputation was completely tarnished at this point. There was no walking back from this. Aaron Burr was the big enemy, public enemy number one of the early republic. Now, that's the story that's out there, and that's the story that's really been going around. But I'd like to introduce you to the Burr you don't know. Because in each of these instances, there are some things that we need to talk about. So with that bank, Federalists had used the Bank of New York and the branch of the Bank of the United States to support their economic and political efforts. Using a bank for political advantage was not anything new. It wasn't something that Aaron Burr came up with. Also, as we mentioned, they controlled the state government at that time. They would not have chartered a Democratic Republican bank. Aaron Burr had to find a way to work around the system in order to challenge the system. He saw the Democratic Republican cause as being just. He wanted to get this political stranglehold that Federalists had. He wanted to demolish that. And he did. He helped with that. He helped Democratic Republicans to become viable in the state of New York. But he had to do it through that deception. He figured out a way, and he made it happen. Now, with that election, and that's the thing, so much emphasis has been, well, Burr was scheming to become president. He wasn't even in Washington at the time. He was at his daughter's wedding. And in fact, we have letters from him. He's telling numerous folks, he's writing to Jefferson, and he's saying, no, I'm not doing anything. I promise. I see you are the top of this ticket. You really should be president, not me. Now, let's go ahead and call a spade a spade. If Aaron Burr had been chosen by the House to become president, he would have. He would have accepted. But we don't really see the evidence that he was actively working to push for his election, to push Jefferson out of the way. But that becomes the story, and there's a reason for that. But before we talk about that, let's talk about that conspiracy. So we really don't know what was the true aim of the Burr conspiracy. There are so many stories, and that was the thing, like the rumor mill just started going wild. Burr's doing something, we don't really know what. And it seems like he was still talking with Jefferson while he was doing all this. We have accounts of him going and having dinner with Jefferson in Washington, D.C., and it seems like there may have been some conversation about doing something in the West. Jefferson and Madison were very interested in this idea of westward expansion, of developing the West. And so there is reason to think that maybe Burr thought that the federal government was with him. He was also talking with other federal officials. He was talking with people in the Army. So he may have thought that maybe they were in with him. Ultimately, the prosecution was bungled. There was little actual evidence. Jefferson even admitted that they really didn't have much evidence. It was a very tenuous claim that they were using for his treacherous activities. Also, Jefferson was applying political pressure. And so he was trying to influence these criminal proceedings. What evidence they did have relied on a very unreliable person, the one who squealed to Jefferson, General James Wilkinson. who was also a secret agent for the Spanish government. He was a paid secret agent. If there was a traitor in this conspiracy, James Wilkinson definitely fit that. But he was unreliable. It all just fell apart. So we have to ask, who benefits from this idea of Aaron Burr as the dastardly person, trying to wreck the early republic? Alexander Hamilton was trying to keep control of the Federalist Party. He was trying to keep that stranglehold over New York because he wanted to use New York in order to be an influence on the national scale again. So by going ahead and saying, this Burr is awful, he's giving an enemy to point to. And this is what Democratic Republicans are going to do if they get in charge. DeWitt Clinton, after the election of 1800, the Clintons start talking with Jefferson, and they really start putting the bug in his ear. Well, isn't it convenient that Aaron Burr nearly became president? You really can't trust that Burr. Believe me, we're from New York. We can tell you, Burr is that scheming person. You can't trust him. Trust us. And it worked. George Clinton became the next vice president. And he actually tried to become president himself. DeWitt Clinton tried for the presidency. By painting Burr as Jefferson's enemy, by putting a divide between them, they were able to gain political influence. And finally, Jefferson. Jefferson was, at the point of the Burr conspiracy, starting to think about his legacy and starting to think about what he was going to leave behind. Now, he wanted westward expansion, but it just wasn't working out. He was also really struggling with this idea of, he was supposed to be for small government, but Jefferson kept expanding the role of government. The Louisiana Purchase, he thought it was unconstitutional, but he did it anyway. The Embargo Act was coming up. He was really expanding government. And if you want to paint yourself as the hero, sometimes you need an enemy to say, this is why we had to do this. We needed somebody to be able to say, that Burr was scheming. He was going to destroy everything. We had to take more power in order to save the Republic. And the myths would compound over the years because Burr became the subject of so many, romance novels, Gothic novels. Put on here the amorous intrigues and adventures of Aaron Burr. That was a pornographic novel about Aaron Burr. It was drawing on this idea of Burr having this, this wild energy about him. First Love was a short story by Eudora Welty in which it has Aaron Burr, a fictional Aaron Burr, making advances on a young man. And then, of course, Gore Vidal's novel Burr really draws on some of these myths and this mystery around Burr, and it becomes part of the novel's plot. And so we build this idea of Burr as this schemer, of this public enemy. But I think the ultimate deception for Aaron Burr was the deception that he pulled on himself. The fact that this is how he's remembered. And he didn't do himself any favors. He didn't disprove that he wasn't committing treason, that he wasn't scheming. He wasn't able to actually answer these charges. And so that's how he's been portrayed. But Aaron Burr would have wanted to be seen more as somebody who was helping to build the nation, as somebody who was a leading, influential leader. He saw himself as being somebody who was a good politician, but for good reasons. And the ultimate deception of Aaron Burr was against himself because here is Burr, who is seen as the big enemy of the early republic. He was a politician. He did what he had to do for political expedience at times, and his reputation is never going to recover. And that is how he deceived everybody, including himself. His schemes themselves, yeah, there's some stuff in there, but really just this idea of Aaron Burr as the boogeyman was the biggest deception of all. And with that, I am going to stop speaking and see if you have any questions. But thank you so much for listening.
Well, you're not completely done speaking. We need to ask you some questions, sir. So you can't get away from us that easy. So with that, that was very interesting. With that, I do have a first question from Ethan Johnson. And he asked, was Burr any more ambitious or duplicitous? I'm so sorry, I butchered that. Was any more ambitious than his contemporaries, or would anyone else in his shoes done exactly what he done outside of shooting Alexander Hamilton?
And some of them would have shot Alexander Hamilton as well. So,
There it is. Easy target.
but yes, that's the thing. And you look at some of his contemporaries, you look at some of these other folks, and you see schemes all over the place. If anybody really wants to do a deep dive into the early republic, there are so many schemes to try and break off parts of the U.S. There was a U.S. Senator, William Blount, who ended up being expelled from the Senate because they found out that he was planning this conspiracy to try and break apart the West from the United States. You've got all these other schemes that are going on. And so I don't see him as being, you know, he isn't exceptionally schemy. He is one of many schemers. And because of the circumstances of the time, he ends up in this place where he is able to gain this intrigue, this air of he is the big villain. He's the one who Hamilton was trying to fight against and Jefferson was trying to fight against. It's the circumstances that elevate him, but the scheming was there, and they're just like now. So many people were ambitious. They wanted that to raise their profile, to have power, to be president. So Aaron Burr wasn't alone in that either.
Just kind of going back to, because I feel like the parallel might be between Hamilton and Burr. Do you think they are really different people at all, or it's Spider-Man pointing at himself?
I think yes and no. I think that there are definitely some distinctions between Hamilton versus Burr, and I explore that a bit more. So I do have a two-part episode. If you, for anybody who would like to learn more about Aaron Burr, I have a two-part episode on the life and career of Aaron Burr. So hope you'll check that out. There were some parallels though, and especially like these were both brilliant men. And that's why they were able to get to the prominence that they achieved. And they were also very proud men. And that's part of the reason why they ended up on that dueling ground. And Hamilton ended up dying because they were both too proud to just go ahead and back away. Let's go ahead and de-escalate this. So there are definitely some parallels, but there are also some distinctions between them two.
Um, just kind of go, do you think, and I'm kind of going off of the Hamilton part because I feel like that's a very interesting aspect of it, but do you think like Burr was just like too rogue for everyone because he wasn't in power? He was kind of like the most, not the most important opposition, but I mean the Federalists kind of just tank after a while. Is he just they had to prop up him as a boogeyman, or he was actually that devious?
Like I said, I don't think that he did himself any favors. I think that he saw he saw that there was a need. He saw that he had to do certain things. He was a political organizer at a time that leaders were supposed to be, oh, well, I really don't want to be president. I really don't want to be president. If you want me to be president, I will be president, but I really don't want to be president. Aaron Burr would just say, hey, I want to be president. Yeah, I do want to advance. And yes, I'm going to make it happen. And so I think that's part of the reason why he's built up as this boogeyman, because he's against this ideal of Cincinnatus, of the reluctant leader who's going to hand over power. Aaron Burr wanted more power, but he also wanted it for certain aims, certain goals. There were certain agenda items that he wanted to achieve, but that doesn't fit with the Cincinnatus myth.
William is just kind of asking for a clarifying question. He admits he has some brain fog, but how was the VP chosen back then, when during the election of 1800? And if Jefferson won, why would he make Burr the vice president?
So that's the thing, and it's one of those things you think about it, and it's you have to think about a time before political parties. So basically, what they did, each elector cast two ballots, but they didn't specify this is the ballot I'm casting for president, this is the ballot I'm casting for vice president. It went into this common pool, and the highest vote getter was supposed to become president. Second highest became vice president. So it wasn't necessarily that the president was choosing a person to run with them as vice president, or that there was any link between those. It was just this common pool that you choose two people from based on how many votes they get. Now, with Washington, of course, everybody knew Washington was going to be president. And you had Alexander Hamilton behind the scenes telling some electors, hey, yes, cast your vote for Washington, but that second vote, don't vote for John Adams, vote for somebody else, to ensure that John Adams didn't end up in this situation, that it didn't end up as Washington and John Adams having the same number of votes. And so that's where this went awry, because ultimately the Democratic Republican electors voted lockstep Jefferson, Burr, but when it's in that common pool, it's just either one of them could be president.
Ethan asked, kind of going off of that partisanship aspect, did Burr fully embrace his role inside of the party, or was he just kind of following the tides?
He actually, and that's the thing, and especially when you're looking at the election of 1800, why in the world would Aaron Burr try and throw over Thomas Jefferson? It doesn't make sense. Thomas Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republicans at that time, and Burr was still young. If he stayed with the party, if he worked with the party, then he would have a chance of advancement in the future. I mean, this guy served as vice president. Maybe he could be president. He really did lock in with the party, but then other people in the party, the Clintons in particular, tried to drive a wedge, and they tried to say, this guy, you can't trust him. And part of that was they were also fighting because in New York state politics is its own animal. The Clintons, the Livingstons, the Burrites, they were all vying for control of the state party. And so it worked in their interest to say, this guy isn't really one of us. And ultimately, he was, and his supporters were kind of driven out.
Do you think his own personality kind of helped aid, like made that a little bit easier, or like can you just kind of go into like how he was as kind of like a person? Was he just grinding against everyone, or how did that work?
Well, and that's the thing, when somebody is so ambitious, and he had a skill, he did have political skill. Of course, you're going to make enemies. And we see this, and that is one of the parallels with Alexander Hamilton, because Hamilton was kind of the same way. Hamilton knew he was the smartest person in the room, and it didn't rub people the right way at times. And so you have these folks looking at him, and they're like, you're just too ambitious. You're just, because he was he wasn't going to say, hey, I don't want power. I don't want to do things. He's going to tell you, yeah, I wanted to do that. And that rubbed people the wrong way. And in order to get power, you had to get power from others. You had to make sure that you were the one who ended up on top. And unfortunately, they were able to drive him out.
So we have about 5 minutes remaining in the session. If anybody does have some last minute questions, feel free to still drop them in the chat or raise your hand at the bottom center of the screen. Um, with that, I'm going to ask one more question unless somebody has one up here. Like, do you think Burr would have just benefited from better PR? Like, if he had more newspapers behind him, it would have or is it just after he killed Alexander Hamilton, that was it? Everybody was sick of him.
Well, and it's interesting because you see, like, after he killed Hamilton, he ended up leaving for a bit. He went further south. And as he was going back to Washington, because at this point he was still the sitting vice president and he had to preside over the Senate. So he had to get back to Washington to actually preside over the Senate. People were cheering him. People were cheering him. They liked that he killed the dreaded Alexander Hamilton, that Federalist dastardly man. Jefferson welcomed him back. He was just like, oh, well, wish I could have had that opportunity. But then when he falls out with Jefferson, when the Burr conspiracy comes, there was just no coming back from that. Like there was just nothing. And it's just this gradual, you almost think of his career going off a cliff and just keeping on hitting things as he's going down. It just gets worse and worse. And then finally he ends up leaving for Europe for a while because it's just, there's no way to make it in the US. He's just too reviled.
Hmm. Okay. All right. And Sydney, I think we'll finish up our questions here with the most important question. How is Luna today?
Oh, thank you. Luna is doing well. It's been a disruptive week. Alex had a quick trip to San Diego for work. And so her schedule's been thrown off, but we're finally settling back in and she's enjoying having us both here. So she's doing well. Thank you for asking.
And Luna is the head cat in chief. So for anyone
Yes.
who doesn't quite know that is.
He runs the house.
Well, I think with that, I'd like to thank Jerry for being with us here today. We do have sessions going on. I believe there's one more session before we have our brown bag lunch. But again, thank you, Jerry, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for watching along. And with that, we'll let you get on with the rest of the sessions, guys. Thank you.